first Australians as the traditional custodians of the continent, whose culture is the oldest living culture in human history. We pay our respects to elders, past, present and emerging, and we respect their cultural heritage, beliefs and relationship with the land. We extend our respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people here today. They share the memories, traditions and hopes of the traditional ancestors with the new generations today and in the future. We would also like to thank them for looking after this land for thousands of years.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our next edition of our Coastcare series this week about how to do a beach survey. For those of you that have questions, please put them in the Q&A. I can see that someone's already asking, what is a beach survey? And that is something that we are going to talk about in our session today. So we're going to look at sort of beach surveys from two sides of it. A general beach kind of combing survey that you're looking a little bit for everything that you might see, whether it's things that are naturally found or things that might be like rubbish and those kinds of things. And then we'll kind of look at the sort of pollution rubbish side of a beach survey and what we can do to help sort of clean up our beaches. So being familiar with your local beach is really important. I've discovered here that the sieve that I've got to help do our survey is a little bit too fine for the sand that I have. So knowing generally a little bit more about your beach will help you get the right equipment for the task as well. Okay, so generally, it is considered that about 85% of the population of Australia lives within 50 kilometres of the coast. So Australia's coastline is huge. It's a sort of about over 35,000 kilometres, which is really, really immense. Now, we have different types of beaches and different types of coastlines, depending on where you live throughout Australia. Certainly around Sydney, where I am, we have sort of our beaches, you know, with rocky outcrops and a beach and a rocky outcrop. And that gives us certain types of habitats and environments, and therefore certain types of animals that we would find. But when we're walking along the beach, we are not finding everything that's in the marine environment. Not everything gets washed ashore. Some things get washed ashore a lot more frequently than others. So imagine walking along, you might see bits of kelp, you might see bits of sponges, even some things like pumice floating. And I've got a selection of things here to show you that different types of things that might get washed up on the shore. So we can see the shiny part here is representing our water of things that you might find really close to the edge. So we've got a sea slug, or also called a blue dragon, a type of sand dollar, which is a type of sea urchin. And then as the tide changes, we might get a second tide line where it's a little bit drier and we might get other materials. So this is called Neptune's necklace, which is a plant. We've got a cuddle bone. You start seeing some shells. And if I scroll up, we start getting things at our highest tide mark. So you might find more layers of shells. We've got some pumice here. So that's a volcanic rock that floats. Over here, we've got some snail eggs. This circular one here is actually called an operculum. It's actually the door of a type of sea snail. Tide, high tide and low tide leaves different marks along the beach. So our low tide, you'll get where the water is still wet, then you'll get maybe a mid tide line and your high tide line all the way up the beach. Now, if it's been really stormy, like we have had lots of big rough waves, you may get a very, very high tide line where you get lots of sort of kelp material washed up on the shore that's sort of left there. And if the next tide isn't as big, some of that material can stay there for quite some time. So as you're walking along, make sure you go from the water's edge all the way up to the beach, up to the high tide mark, to really look at the different things that are being deposited at the different tide marks. So most of the time we have sort of our low tide, our normal high tide. We also have our spring and our king tides. So if we get a really big king tide and a really big storm, we can actually find that some of the material that's washed up onto the beach can almost get up to the footpaths and those kinds of things. And depending on where you are, up to the people's backyards or front doors of if they live really close to the coast. So the storm surge and those kinds of things can make that material get washed much, much further onshore. Now, if we have a look at this one here, so these are all different things that I've collected over the years that you may recognise. So here we have, it's actually a piece of sandstone that has been in the water long enough, or it's been broken off one of the rocks of the rocky reef, and it's got little barnacle marks in it. So that's actually the hard outer case of a living thing. It's a type of crustacean called a barnacle. We've got lots of dried bits of seaweed, dried bits of sponge that have washed up on the shore. When the sponge is living underwater, it's often got more colour in it. Lots of different shells. Sometimes if we look really closely, we can also notice this little bit of shell has a hole in it. So that hole is from a predatory sea snail that's actually been able to push the hole through and eat the animal, which is called a limpet, through. So sometimes you see holes in the shells, and it is naturally occurring. Another one that we see really commonly is a cuddle bone. Now, these ones are washed up on the shore really commonly because they float. So they're a sort of a float part that are in cuttlefish. And depending on the size of the cuddle bone gives you a clue about how big the cuttlefish is. Lots of different marks in it. So that can actually help scientists work out who's been eating the cuttlefish, but also other animals that may be chewing on the cuddle bones as they are floating or moving through the water, or once they're up on the shore. You may notice things like this. These are pipi shells. Again, various sizes, and bits of pumice. Depending on whether we've had lots of big volcanic eruptions in the Pacific Ocean underwater, mostly these eruptions, sometimes we will get lots and lots of pumice washed up on the shore, because pumice is a volcanic rock and it floats, so it moves with the tides. As that pumice bumps into each other, it breaks down into smaller and smaller pieces. So by over a long period of time, we may only find really small pieces of pumice, or it breaks down completely and you won't see any of it floating around. So these are certainly some of the natural things that we might find washed up on the shore. But within our natural environments, we do often find things that shouldn't be there. And there's something that when you are going to your local area, often you will start seeing those different. So it could be that something that wasn't supposed to be there was lots and lots of pumice. Even though that is a naturally occurring item, it may give you a clue that there was something underwater going on months or a year before to put that extra material in. Sometimes we get things washed up on the shore if there's been an accident at sea. So sometimes shipping containers fall off boats, and material gets washed up onto the shore, and lots of the same thing. A very famous example of that many years ago was a shipping container full of yellow rubber ducks. And those rubber ducks fell off a particular ship. They knew when it had happened, and it ended up providing lots of really important information about our ocean currents. And they put out a bit of a really early citizen science program, and that really means that the people were able to report when they'd found one of the rubber ducks, and back to the company. I think it was one of the universities that was tracking it, and they were able to see how long it was taking for these rubber ducks to get to different places around the world. I might see if I can find a link to that story and send it to you later, because it is very interesting about thinking what gets washed up on our shores, how our ocean currents work, and how certain things end up in some places but not others. Won't it be harmful if you find things like animals, won't they get annoyed or disturbed? Absolutely. That is one of the key things when you are doing a beach survey or beach combing, is really making sure that you're not always picking things up. So if you are, wearing gloves, especially if you're looking at the rubbish side of it as well, but definitely being careful, because you might have some shells are empty at the moment, but they may actually become a great habitat for something like a hermit crab. You may find other things that you think aren't alive, but actually they're just hiding in their shells because they're waiting for the tide to take them back out. So a great way to do these beach surveys is actually taking photos and recording that information. Now, when you're taking photos, you need to use something called a scale. So then you know, if you're identifying something later, how big or small it was. So a really simple scale is using a coin, but you can also print out little centimetre scales that have a white centimetre, black centimetre, white centimetre, black centimetre. You can cut them out, or you can simply take a little ruler. Anything that you can compare the size to is a great way of finding out that scale. So when you go back to the classroom or to home and you're trying to identify something, you know whether it's this big or this big. So scale is really important. Any of the natural things that you find, it's suggested that you leave them behind, especially if you are in a national park, a marine park, or any protected zones. You are not allowed to remove any natural material. Now, in saying that, if you're finding rubbish, it is 100% a great idea to remove that rubbish with you. So again, taking a photo of what it looked like in situ, so that means in place, and then you can remove the rubbish and take it away and leave all of the natural material there to either break down and become a food source, or maybe even become someone's home. So that's a great one, Aussie, to remember not to take too many things away. If I find a cuddle bone and give it to my birds, they eat it. Yes, so cuddle bones are often collected, or even you can buy them for birds. So it really helps them with their beak, and it's calcium. So it gives them lots of strength for their beak and their bones as well. I do occasionally collect the cuddle bones because I use them in my my talks and my information, and also I'm looking for ones that have all of those marks in them to see if I can identify whether it's a bird beak, it could be a fish bite, or another animal that is chewing on those cuddle bones in their journey as they're moving around the sea. What are the most common things that you find on the beach? Well, you know what? That really depends on the beach. So if you are very familiar with your local beach, you'll get used to the kinds of things that you might find. So what I was showing you before, these are really common things that you would find. So small pieces of sponge, bits of seaweed, whether they're really dried or fresh, different types of shells, bits of pumice, because they float, that's why they're so oftenly found, and bits of cuddle bone, either broken up or whole. You may also find something like this. Okay, so this one is a shark egg. So it's a Port Jackson shark egg. Now, these ones are empty. They come out through the hole here. So I know this one's empty, and after it's out of the water, they dry. I was walking along the high tide mark. I was counting how many shark eggs I found. I got up to 60 in a 10-minute walk. So it could even be something like that, it was really unusual to see so many shark eggs. Now, most of them I could feel were empty. I did feel one that seemed to be sealed and was heavy. So I put that straight back in the water and hope that that animal may still be able to hatch out. But the rest of them were empty. So once they're empty, they're a little bit lighter. And because it was really rough, that's why they were getting washed up on the shore. So sometimes it could be something unusual like that you might identify. And you may simply do a count. So if you are at your local beach and there's something unusual, that's a good thing to do. Occasionally, you may also find something like this. So this one here is a weedy sea dragon. The weedy sea dragon here can get washed up on the shore because they have a hard outer case. They do dry, definitely don't collect them straight away because they are very, very smelly, but they will end up drying. So again, if it's a marine park or a natural environment national park, you aren't allowed to collect anything, even if it's dead. Why are there so many dead cuttlefish? We've got another question here. So the reason why you find so many cuttle bones is there really are a lot of cuttlefish. They're quite a common marine animal to find. Unless you're snorkeling or scuba diving a lot, you probably don't realise that. So pretty much every snorkel or scuba dive I do, I will see cuttlefish varying in size from sort of, little ones all the way to quite large, sort of well over 50 centimetre in size ones. So there are a lot of cuttlefish, and of course their bones, they break when the animal dies. The cuttle bone floats. So they can actually be floating around the surface of the water for quite some time, coming in and out of the tide line. And often you'll find only broken bits because they've either been eaten or broken when they've been bumped into each other. So that's why you probably see them so much, because they can end up in the environment for a while because they float around. What is the biggest and smallest type of shell? Well, it depends on the stage of the life cycle of that particular animal. There are lots of shells that can get well over 30 centimetres in size that can live for quite some time, but there are also lots of shells that you might find on the rock pools that are smaller than the size of your little pinky fingernail. So there is a big variety. Yes, you might find a skeleton of a fish. And we've got a question here about what is sand? Well, sand essentially is broken up bits of shell that, again, anything bumping into each other over time breaks down into smaller and smaller pieces. And we'll look at how that is important when we start thinking about plastics in our environment. So a non-natural, a natural process on a not natural material. Weedy sea dragons and the leafy sea dragons. And yesterday someone informed me that they'd found a new species of sea dragon in Western Australia called the ruby sea dragon. So now we have 3 different species found throughout Australia. Okay, let's have a look at some of the slides here. So looking here is that high tide mark that I was talking to you about. So we can see the dry sand in the top corner of both photos. On the top right, and then we can see lots of sort of vegetation. Now in here we've got bits of what we call debris, so driftwood, sticks, plant material. There'd be grasses from seagrass, little floats that we've got on some of the kelps as well, and then different shells in between. Now this is a lucky environment. I didn't see many bits of rubbish. On this beach I have. This is up at the Central Coast, but in this particular storm event, I didn't see lots of rubbish, which was really pleasing. Sometimes we might see things like this. So whoever mentioned dead fish and dead skeletons, absolutely. So this is a particular fish. It's been obviously around for quite some time. It's quite dried out. The skin's coming off, and it's, it wasn't too smelly at this point. We've got particular types of shells. These are turban shells. This is a cartwright shell, a bit of a mollusks, some sponge. This is another piece of sponge that's still got some of its colour. And something interesting here is actually the root ball of brown kelp. So that's what it attaches to the rocks under the water. And when it's really, really rough, it washes to shore, it gets ripped out. And so all of that bits of seaweed is broken up, and a little piece of Neptune's necklace. So they were just a few things that I found a few years ago. Sometimes we may see all of these sand balls. Now, this is certainly not after a storm event. This was a very sort of where you get the very tidal, low, flat areas. You may see these sand balls before. Technically, you could even call them sort of sand vomit, and they're actually crabs that are eating the sand, trying to get all of the food particles out of them, and they kind of roll them up and then spit them back out again. And these are the 2 types of crabs that make them. So soldier crabs and ghost crabs. And you'll often see quite big numbers of them. And this is a close-up of a ghost crab here. Really well camouflaged. They're very, very small. Don't often see them, and they blend into the sand absolutely perfectly. So I was very lucky to capture this guy. Well, in a photo. I didn't take him home. So other things, this is actually a big piece of conjavoy, otherwise known as sea squirts, that you'll often find attached to the rocks around the edges of the beach. And on this particular one was all of these eggs, and these are the cartwright snail eggs, and this is a picture of that snail there. So sometimes you might find different things washed up on the shore that you're not expecting. So these are all snail eggs of this particular type. Then we start getting into some of our rubbish and things that float like to have other things attached to them. So this is a trusty thong that has been washed up on the shore, and it's got all of these little organisms on them, and these are called goose neck barnacles. And often when you see things washed up on the floor, the shore, that are animals that are material that floats, so driftwood, natural materials like that, but also thongs and other big pieces of plastic. Over time, they often get colonized or by these gooseneck barnacles that try to find them home. And if they're out there long enough, you'll get even more types of organisms attached to them. Now, sometimes our litter becomes a home. So I have seen glass bottles being used as habitats. This one's a fish here, but I've also seen octopus use glass as homes. I've seen hermit crabs. And an example on land recently was that I had seen was a leaf curling spider that usually uses a leaf, was using a chocolate wrapper to curl up to be its protection. So a lot of animals will use whatever is around them. It doesn't mean that it's a good thing, because something like glass can take thousands of years to break down a whole bottle like that. But unfortunately, most of the time, the glass gets broken into smaller pieces and can become quite dangerous, either for people cutting themselves, but also for animals eating sharp things as well. And this is unfortunately what can happen on many beaches. Now, this is a beach in Indonesia, and we've got, after a storm, lots of plant material, bits of coconut husk, but also fishing net, plastic bottles, plastic cups, all the way along the beach. And this is exactly what we need to look at, and how we can work out how to reduce the amount of that material that ends up in our environments. What happens on land and how that impacts the sea. So at the moment, I mentioned that it's raining here in Sydney. I was driving past a construction site a few moments ago, and it was just brown water running out of that construction site. So all of that sediment was washing into the stormwater drains, and that will also wash into our waterways. And as that water is moving down hills through our catchments and through our waterways, it is picking up not only things like sediment, but maybe oil, maybe fertilizers out of gardens. It may be picking up plastic, either whole bottles or bits of bottles, and broken bits of plastic and broken bits of glass. All of those things end up in the lowest point of the catchments, which are our rivers, and ultimately will then wash out into the ocean. And so that's one of the key ways a lot of this material gets into our sea. Other things, it is coming through from wind. So just land-based pollution. Plastic bags is a great example of that. Once the wind catches them, they can travel for some time. We don't see it as often, but newspapers used to be a really bad example of that, because they weren't sort of stapled together. If a newspaper ended up in the park and it was windy, every single piece of that newspaper would separate and end up flying around, getting wet, sometimes blocking the drains and sometimes ending up in the drains as well. So I'll just go back to our questions here. Do shells come from snail shells? So yes, going back to that, depending on the type. So we've got the group called mollusks, where our snails are from, and then there are two parts. There are groups that are called bivalves, which would be like our pippies, that have two shells that open and close. And then we have others that are gastropods that have a single shell. So an example of that would be this limpet here, and your normal garden snail. So these shells that we find washed up on the beach are the discarded shell of one of these mollusks, either a bivalve or a gastropod. Usually they're not discarded, so they don't shed their skin. It means that the animal has died. Either it's been hunted, if we can see a little hole in it like that, or it's just ended up dying of old age, and then the shells end up getting washed up on the shore over time, breaking down and giving us our sand. So rubbish on the sea isn't bad if animals live in it. So, you know, there are plenty of habitats for these animals to find if we leave their environment naturally. So even though some of the rubbish like glass bottles and things like that may be used as a habitat, it doesn't mean it's a good habitat for them to have. It won't last as long, and you know, it might break down and release toxic chemicals into the environment that will have long-term effects to those different animals. So even though some animals do use these materials, it's still not good to have them in the environment. Is that an octopus behind you and a starfish? I do have an octopus behind me, and it is what we call a replica. So that one is a model. Anything that's soft-bodied and squishy tends to be really hard to dry and preserve. So an octopus absolutely really would be very difficult. So that one is a model. The starfish, though, is a dried starfish. So it is one that over time has died, and it's been dried naturally. All of the things that end up being dried lose their colour. So if you do see sort of lots of really colourful things like starfish and seahorses and those kinds of things, generally they've been dyed or painted later because they don't stay that colour naturally. Okay, we've got another question about shells. So, yep, the animals that have shells will actually grow them. So they are absorbing calcium out of the water and out of their food, and they help grow their shells. If I can find one here, you can have a little look on the inside. I'll just zoom back in. You can kind of see the growth rings. So we can kind of see the different color layers as it's growing as we go inside. So this is a big one here. I can tell it's been really old because it's actually got barnacles growing on it as well. And it grows this way. So the spiral. So as it starts out, it's quite small. And as it grows, it adds a piece of material. So on this side here, it will grow and it gets to a certain size and then it stops. So yeah, so they will grow from being very small, and they're doing that out of the food and the energy that they have in their body to be able to add that hard layer as they grow. And it's one of the things that all animals that have shells can do that. Starfish will grow as well. You know, they don't start that size. They actually will grow through certain stages of their life. Depending on where you are, you may only have small bits of things that aren't supposed to be there, but in other places you may have a lot more. So you could end up with whole cans, whole bottles being found, full plastic bags, but you also may end up with something a little bit more like this. So we've got our beautiful environment that we had before. Now there's been a party on the beach. So we've got leftover food wrapping, rubber bands. Someone's had a popper. We've got our plastic of our straw. Now, big things like this, it is easy to physically remove. But when we start getting small things like foil, broken pieces of packaging, fishing line, tags, they are much harder to remove. We've got a big cap here. Again, that's probably something that we can physically remove. But when we're doing our beach survey, don't want to remove anything until we've taken a photograph of it. And that's a key thing. So even now, you can see that natural environment has a combination of natural and non-natural things, from plastics, paper, and bits of metal in there as well. Look at how we start our beach survey. As I mentioned, doing things on the high tide mark of your beach, getting a tape measure or a rope and laying out an area. So it's called a sort of a transect, and a transect is following a line. Now there's two ways you can do your beach survey. You can do a transect from the high tide mark down to the low tide mark, and you can do lines that way, or you can do a transect along your high tide mark. So there's two different ways to do it, depending if you're doing in lots of big groups or small groups and what you want to find. Are you wanting to discover the different marine life that's living from the low tide mark to the high tide mark? Then you'd like to do your transect that way. But if you're, say, looking at a marine pollution survey, you probably want to follow along your high tide mark. So again, knowing the purpose of your survey will help you work out which type that you do. Now, the one I'm going to show you first is a beach survey I did with a big group of people. So this was when we were finished and we were laying out the different things that were collected. So we did find a thong. So it's not something funny that may never happen. We absolutely found a thong on that beach survey. Bits of charcoal. This becomes a lot more common after we have had things like bushfires. The charcoal often ends up floating around. Feathers. A pencil. Now, whether that was just from someone doing the survey that particular day that lost a pencil, or maybe a school excursion another day, or someone that was, writing a letter and left it behind. Lots of broken bits of shell as well. Big bits of sponge, and then lots of different plant material as well. So other than the thong, we did find some bits of pottery from a shipwreck from the 1950s. But other than that, we didn't find a lot of rubbish. Now, this particular type of survey, we were removing everything to a central table that was near the beach. Otherwise, it's great to take photos. Oh, and I forgot to point out, of course, we had found some nails in there. Nails that are sort of rusted together in a bit of a collection. So one of the big pieces of equipment that's good to use if you are doing really looking for some microplastics is bringing along a sieve. So you can get these plastic sieves, but you can also get metal ones as well, especially if you're trying to reduce the amount of plastics you're using, and the sieve is really useful because you can go through the sand. So you can actually get things that separate the sand out from the bits of plastic. And it's a great way to then photograph what you've found and then have a rubbish bag with you that you can then remove that rubbish as well. If you were really wanting to focus on microplastics, you would actually separate your microplastics from your big bits of plastic like your bottles and your lid tops, and you can actually take them back home or back to the classroom or maybe a shady area, and you can identify the different types of microplastics. And I'll show that to you in a moment. So we can see a whole lot here that has been found. Always wearing gloves when we're working with any sort of rubbish and things like that, because we don't necessarily know where they've been. Again, another great reason to be photographing, because you can really capture what is happening and always identify things from those photographs at a later stage. So if we're looking at different types of microplastics, there are two types to look at. Primary microplastics are things like microbeads and pellets. So they're things that have been used in toothpaste and body washes. Thankfully, a lot of places are stopping the use of that, because what it's doing is putting small pieces of plastic directly into the environment. And then we have secondary microplastics. Now, they are big things like our bottles, like our caps, that are banging into each other over many years and breaking down into smaller bits and pieces. So this is the sort of little capture of some microplastics. We have our sort of round pellets, which are those often those primary microplastics, fragments of plastics, which are bits and pieces that are broken off. Then we often have some fibres, which could be coming from, say, nylon clothes, ropes and strings, fishing line, foams, which are often things like styrofoams and those kinds of things, and also films, which are really like your thin bits of plastic, your plastic bags, your straw wrappers, all of those kinds of things would be considered films. And some of these microplastics can actually form something that's called a formite, and they can actually then sort of absorb hazardous chemicals and pathogens and help that move through the marine environment. So it's sometimes not just a localized problem, it's the flow-on effect of the microplastics as well. And the big thing is when animals are eating these, it gets into the whole food chain. So there is very few animals now that are caught that don't have some evidence of microplastics or larger plastics within their body. Can any marine animals actually break down rubbish? Well, they're doing lots of research on different bacteria that can help break down some of the rubbish. So they really are looking at what we can do to help recycle the rubbish that's already out in the environment. How do sea snails move when they have no bones? So sea snails, like garden snails, move on a foot. So and they travel around on that particular foot that comes out of the bottom of the snail. What's really cool with some of the sea snails is they have this thing like this one here called an Operculum, and it's like a door that they can close. So often we'll see them washed up on the shore, and you'll just see this bit washed up, which is the door. So if you ever see those, it's actually a sea snail door. So when it's hot or they need to close up for predators, they can actually close the door. This is not the right one for this particular snail, and they can protect themselves that way. So many of the land snails have that. When they come back out, they've got that foot, and then they move along either the rocky surface or the sand, and that's how they travel around. So they don't need bones. The water helps them keep their body shape and become quite large, and they've got that shell to protect them as well. Are some sharks poisonous? So we don't have any poisonous sharks. Poisonous is something that you need to eat, whereas venomous is something that needs to be injected into you, so either by a spine or a bite. Do starfish have brains? That is a great question. So a lot of these invertebrates don't have a brain the way that we consider sort of animals with backbones, those vertebrate animals do, but they do have sort of, collections of sort of, what's the best way to describe it? Sort of neuron bundles that do help them make decisions and choose. So it may be not a brain the same way as we know it, but they can think and make decisions. So sea stars are not just moving with the ocean current, they are actively going out to hunt and make decisions. They've got little tube feet underneath their body on the 5 limbs mostly, and then they've in the middle of their body they've got their mouth, and yeah, they're really quite cool. But yeah, not the same way that we know as brains, but they certainly are actively making decisions with what they're doing. How come some animals have no bones at all? So that's really getting to sort of the big classifications of animals. So you've got vertebrate animals. They are the ones that have internal skeletons. So mammals, birds, fish, amphibians, and reptiles are the 5 groups of animals that do have those internal skeletons. All the rest of the animals are a group called invertebrates. By far, most of the animals on Earth and in the ocean are invertebrates. So about 98% of all life on Earth doesn't have a backbone. And they have different techniques to protect themselves. Some of them, like snails, have a hard outer case, that shell that they carry around with them, they can move inside to protect themselves, whether they're on land or marine species. Things like insects often have that exoskeleton that help protect them as well, stop them drying out. But we have other animals like worms, and by far most of the species of worms are living in the ocean, and they don't have those kinds of protections. Some of them are using camouflage or spines or stinging cells, all sorts of different things for these animals to protect themselves. How are snails good for the environment? Well, they are a really excellent part of the food chain. So that's one important part as well. They help eat certain things that keep the keep that ecosystem in balance. And there are lots of different species of snails, both on land and in the marine environment. But by far, most of the mollusks are found in the ocean. And mollusks are the second largest group of animals outside arthropods. So arthropods are your insects, spiders, crustaceans, millipedes and centipedes. Mollusks are the second biggest group after that. So there are hundreds of thousands of species of mollusks around. Okay, guys, we've got lots of great questions, but we've got just a couple more things to wrap up in terms of our beach survey and how to do it. I've shared lots of information earlier today with data sheets about how to record the information with your beach survey. And really, it is thinking about those different environments along your beach and what you want to do with your survey. So whether or not you want to look at the animals that are there, or whether you want to look at both the animals and the rubbish and pollution. Anytime you are exploring your beach environment, make sure you take a spare rubbish bag with you. And when you are looking, even if you're not doing a formal survey, take that rubbish away with you that you might see. It might only be a bottle cap or a bottle or a can, and it may only be 1 or 2 pieces of rubbish, but other times you may find lots of rubbish. And anything that you remove from the environment, if you can recycle it, if not, dispose of it correctly. And that is material that won't end up breaking down into microplastics and won't end up becoming part of the food chain as well. So really important to think about how we get some of that material out of our environment. So all of those things that we've looked at this week for Coastcare is the idea of what happens on land does impact our waterways. So think when it's windy, at any time really, making sure you dispose of your rubbish carefully, thinking about recycling, upcycling, reusing, reducing the amount of packaging that there may be around are all fabulous ideas that we can all do as individuals to help make that long-term difference. Remember, if it is really rough and if it has been really stormy and the beach is not safe, do not go out and do a beach survey. Don't do any beach combing. Make sure you go at low tide. Make sure you go with an adult, and then you'll have a lot of fun. Excellent. So thank you very much, everyone. And I look forward to see you again soon. Bye-bye.